They took the bottom land, they took the combine, they took the certificates of deposit, they took the good truck, and the account with Carl's name still warm on it, and they left her the house nobody wanted, out past the tree line, where the roof had a hole the size of a dinner plate. She can keep the old Tanner place, Wade said, over paper plates of funeral ham, since nobody else wants it anyway. Nobody laughed. Nobody had to. The silence did it for them. Marion Tanner said thank you. She said it quiet, and she meant it. That is what 53 years teaches a woman. Say thank you and mean it, even when your own son is dividing your husband's grave dirt into lots. Then she drove out to that forgotten house alone. On her knees in the kitchen, she pulled up a floorboard. She was only looking for a lost earring. She was not looking for her own name. She found it anyway. But before the floorboard, there was the funeral. Marion Louise Tanner was 76 years old. She had been married to Carl Tanner for 53 of those years, widowed for 11 weeks now. She did not raise her voice at the funeral luncheon. She did not need to. The Redbud Crossing Methodist Fellowship Hall smelled like coffee urns and cold cuts. 40 people stood around holding paper plates. Wade Tanner, 51 years old, her firstborn, made his announcement like he was reading off a grocery list. Mum's already said she's fine with the arrangement, Wade told the room. The house on Chalk Hollow. She can have that. Rest of it we're handling through the estate the way Dad would have wanted. Dad would have wanted. Marion had heard that phrase 4 times since Carl died. Each time it meant something differently. Each time it meant something Wade wanted. The lawyer was a thin, nervous man named Delacroix. He'd inherited half the will readings in Barrett County from his retired father. He cleared his throat and lost his place twice, reading the document aloud. He was 60 and still fumbled a page like a boy called on in class. Marion reached into her purse without a word. She slid her own reading glasses across the table towards him. He blinked at her, surprised. Then he put them on and found his line again. She had done that her whole married life. Smoothed a stumble before her own turn came. Nobody in that room noticed her do it. Not even her daughter. Marion had stopped expecting them to. The will was simple on its face. The 200-acre working farm, the equipment, the cash accounts, split 3 ways among Wade, his sister Diane, and the youngest Curtis. Curtis had moved to Springfield years ago. He only came home for funerals and Christmas photos, whichever came first that year. The old Tanner homestead out on Chalk Hollow Road went to Marion outright. Carl's own father had built it in the 1930s. Carl himself had stopped farming it a decade back. 40 acres. 1 collapsing farmhouse. A barn with a hole in its roof you could throw a cat through. Not worth the taxes on it, Wade said later in the parking lot, loud enough for her to hear as she got in her car. Maybe $2,000 for the scrap tin. Mum, you sure you don't want us to just handle the sale for you? Save you the hassle. I'm sure, Marion said. She was 76 years old. She had raised 3 children on egg money and a bookkeeping job at the Redbud Crossing Feed and Grain. In 53 years of marriage to Carl Tanner, she had learned exactly one lesson that mattered more than any other. Keep your own name on something. Somewhere. Always. Carl used to say it different ways at different times. She never once asked him why. A woman married that long learns which questions to leave alone. Denise, Wade's wife, had already put up a for sale sign on the good bottomland. Before the funeral flowers wilted. Motivated sellers. It read, in a Springfield realtor's confident red letters. Staked into ground Carl Tanner had turned with his own tractor for 40 years. Marion drove past it on her way home from the luncheon. She did not slow down. She drove out to Chalk Hollow Road instead. Not home. Out there. The forgotten farmhouse sat 3 miles past a working farm the family kept. Down a gravel track gone soft with weeds. Behind a stand of sumac that had grown wild and red since anyone last trimmed it. Carl had stopped keeping the place up around the time his knees went, a decade back. It showed. The porch sagged on one side like a tired shoulder. A window on the second floor had been boarded since a storm took the glass out 3 winters ago. The whole house smelled, even from the yard, of dust and old rain. Ollie Krantz was already there, pushing a mower across grass that came up past his knees in patches. Ollie was 82 years old. He'd worked for Carl Tanner for 40 years, hauling grain and mending fence and doing whatever else a farm needed doing. He still showed up out here twice a month, cutting grass around a house nobody lived in. Didn't figure anybody'd need to see it looking decent, Ollie said, when Marion got out of her car. But I keep at it anyway. Carl's still paying you for this, Marion asked, half a joke. Ollie didn't answer right away. He looked at the house instead of at her, the way men his age did when a question landed somewhere they hadn't expected. House pays its own way, he said finally. Has for years. Marion filed that away without understanding it. She had a lot to file away that week. She walked the property, a little before going inside, the way she used to when Carl was alive, when they'd drive out here on Sunday afternoons just to remember what the place had once been. The barn stood at the far end of the yard. Its roof had half opened to the sky, where the hole had spread over the years. The wide double doors hung crooked on one hinge. Marion stepped inside carefully. The smell of old hay and rusted iron hung thick in the still air. Dust motes turned slow in the shaft of light coming through the broken roof. Carl's father's tools still hung along one wall. Untouched in decades, a row of hand saws and worn leather harnesses gone stiff with age. In the far corner sat the old tractor Carl had learned to drive on as a boy. Tyres long flat, seat cracked. Nobody had bothered to haul it off for scrap because hauling it off would have cost more than the scrap was worth. She ran her hand along the tractor's rusted fender. She remembered Carl telling the story once, decades back, putting that very tractor through the side of this very barn at 14 years old. His own father had been too relieved he wasn't hurt to properly punish him for it. The barn had been patched and repatched ever since. Board over board. A running family joke about how many times one wall could be rebuilt before somebody finally tore the whole thing down and started fresh. Nobody ever had. Marion understood now, standing there, that neither had Carl. Not really. Not all the way. Some part of him had never stopped believing this ground, however battered it looked from the road, was worth keeping standing. She found nothing else in the barn that day. No hidden compartments, no second cache of coins, just an old man's boyhood mistake, preserved in weathered lumber, and a tractor too stubborn to finish rusting all the way through. But she stood there a long while anyway, in the dust and the slanted light, before finally walking back across the yard to the kitchen door. She let herself in through the kitchen door, which stuck the way it always had. She stood a long minute in the room where Carl's mother had once canned tomatoes every August of her life. Dust sheeted the counters. A dead mouse lay curled behind the stove, long gone. The linoleum had buckled near the window where rain had gotten in. She was looking for her earring. She'd worn her mother's garnet studs to the funeral, one for each ear. A pair that had survived 60 years, 3 moves, and a house fire in 1974. Somewhere between the graveside service and the fellowship hall, she had lost the left one. She thought foolishly that she might have dropped it here months back, the last time she'd walked through with Carl before he got too weak to make the trip. It was a thin hope and she knew it. But grief makes a woman chase thin hopes into empty houses. There was nowhere else that week she wanted to be. She got down on her knees by the window, where the light was best. She ran her hand along the seam where the linoleum had pulled away from the baseboard. The board beneath it gave. Not much, just a half-inch of give under her palm. A floorboard should have been flush and solid. Instead it rocked like a loose tooth. Marion sat back on her heels and looked at it a long moment. 53 years, married to a man who fixed everything himself. A man who could not stand a loose hinge or a dripping faucet. And this one board sat wrong in his own family's kitchen. Carl would have fixed that. Carl fixed everything. Unless he hadn't wanted it fixed. She worked her fingers under the edge of the board and pulled. It came up easier than 50 years of nails had any right to allow, like it had been lifted and set back 100 times. Underneath sat a rectangular gap in the subfloor. Inside it, wrapped in an oilcloth gone stiff and yellow, sat a coffee can. Marion did not move for a moment. Somewhere outside, Ollie's mower cut off. The sudden quiet felt loud. She lifted the can out. It was heavier than an empty can had any business being. When she pried the plastic lid loose, it gave with a small hiss of trapped air. Decades old. Silver dollars. Dozens of them, packed tight. Old piece dollars and Morgans gone dull with age. Marion Tanner, 76 years old, sat on the floor of a house her family had called worthless and held a can of coins she had never once known existed. Not in 53 years of marriage. She did not know yet what any of it meant. She only knew, kneeling there in the dust with her lost earring still nowhere in sight, that her husband had kept something from her, in the one room of the one house nobody wanted. Whatever it was, he had wanted her, specifically, to be the one who found it. "Carl," she said out loud, to the empty kitchen, "what did you do?" She counted the coins later that night, at her own kitchen table, under better light. 53 of them, one for every year of the marriage. She thought, at first, that was the whole of it. A sentimental gesture, a private habit of a man who never talked about his feelings, but found other ways to keep score. She almost cried over it, right there at the table. Because 53 silver dollars felt like exactly the kind of quiet thing Carl would do and never mention. Then she noticed the oilcloth wrapping had a second layer, folded inside it, tucked flat against the bottom of the can beneath where the coins had sat. It was paper. Old paper, brittle at the folds. The kind of document paper that goes soft and thin after 60 years in the dark. She unfolded it at the table, carefully. The way she'd learned handling church records for the Ladies' Auxiliary for 30 years. One crease at a time, so nothing tore. It was a deed, a Barrett County warranty deed, dated 1961, the year she and Carl were married, describing 40 acres and all improvements thereon, in Section 14 of Redbud Township. The grantee's name, typed clean at the top, was not Carl Tanner, it was Louise Marion Dietz, her own maiden name. The name she had not gone by since the summer she married Carl Tanner at the Methodist Church on 2nd Street, a name that existed now only on her birth certificate, and apparently on a 63-year-old deed to the very land her family had just called worthless in a parking lot. Marion sat very still at her kitchen table for a long time. The deed lay flat under her two hands, like she was afraid it might blow away, though there was no wind in the room at all. She remembered, then, something Carl had said to her once, decades ago, on their 10th anniversary, the two of them sitting on the porch of the working farmhouse, with a bottle of cheap champagne between them. She had teased him about something, some small forgotten slight, the way young wives do. He'd gone quiet a moment before he answered her. "If this family ever forgets you, Louise," he'd said, using her real first name instead of Marion, the way he almost never did, the house never will. She had laughed it off at the time. Sweet talk, she'd thought. An old-fashioned husband trying to say something tender in the only clumsy way he knew how. It had not been sweet talk. It had been a legal fact, folded into an oilcloth, buried under a floorboard in a house her own son had just called worth nothing more than its scrap tin roof. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the table with the deed and the coffee can of coins until the sky outside her window went from black to grey, turning one word over and over in her mind, a word she had not used for herself in 63 years. Dietz. In the morning she called the only lawyer's office left in Redbud Crossing, a young woman named Sarah Fenn, who had taken over the Delacroix Practices overflow work 2 years back. The ladies at church said she actually read every file she inherited, instead of skimming it. Marion made the appointment for that same afternoon. She did not tell Wade. She did not tell Diane or Curtis. She had spent 53 years learning when to speak and when to wait. Every instinct told her this was a morning for waiting, and an afternoon for finding out exactly what she was holding. She dressed carefully for the appointment, the way she dressed for church. She brought the deed in a manila envelope. She brought the coffee can too, some part of her, the part that had kept every receipt of her marriage, in a cedar box under her bed for 53 years, understood already. A woman does not walk into a lawyer's office with evidence and leave the evidence at home. She drove past the Bottomland on her way into town. The for sale sign was still there. Red letters bright in the morning sun. Motivated sellers. Staked into ground. Carl had turned with his own hands for 40 years. Past it, at the far tree line where the Bottomland met the county road, Marion noticed something she hadn't the day before. A truck she didn't recognise. White with a company logo on the door, parked at the fence line. 2 men in orange vests walked the ground with survey equipment, driving stakes with little pink flags into soil that, as far as Marion Tanner knew, belonged entirely to her son and his sale sign. She slowed the car just enough to read the logo on the truck door before the road curved away. Barrett Aggregate Materials, it said, in dark green letters. Beneath it, in smaller type, she had to squint to catch Surveying Division. She did not know yet what that meant either, but she had learned, over one long night at her kitchen table, that finding out what she does not know was no longer a small thing to be put off. She drove on into town, the deed and the coffee can on the seat beside her, and did not look back at the flags in the field. Sarah Fenn's office sat above what used to be Redbud Crossing's only bank. In a suite the old Delacroix practice had occupied since before Marion was born. Sarah herself was younger than Marion's own children, 34 maybe. Reading glasses pushed up into dark hair. A desk stacked with folders in a way that looked organised rather than chaotic. Marion had learned to notice that distinction from 30 years of keeping the Feed Co-op's own books straight. "Mrs. Tanner," Sarah said, standing to shake her hand. "I was sorry to hear about Carl. He helped my dad's firm out of a mess once, years back, something about a boundary dispute with the county. I don't think I ever thanked him properly. He wouldn't have wanted thanking," Marion said. "He'd have wanted it done right is all." She set the manila envelope on the desk. Beside it, after a moment's hesitation, the coffee can. Sarah opened the envelope first. She unfolded the deed the way Marion had, slow and careful at the creases. Then she went quiet, in a way that made the room feel smaller. She read it once, then she read it again, this time tracing the legal description line by line with one finger, checking something against a map Marion couldn't see. "Mrs. Tanner," Sarah said finally, "where did you find this?" "Under a floorboard, in the old house on Chalk Hollow. I wasn't looking for it." "This is a warranty deed," Sarah said, "dated April of 1961. To Louise Marion Dietz." "That's you." "That was me. Before I married Carl." "It's recorded," Sarah said. "See the stamp? Bottom corner, County Recorder's seal. This isn't a draft somebody forgot to file. This went through the courthouse. It's been sitting in the official record for 63 years. She looked up. "Does your family know this exists?" "My family doesn't know I exist most days," Marion said. She was surprised at how flat and true it came out. No bitterness in it at all. Just a fact she'd finally said out loud. Sarah didn't laugh, which Marion appreciated. She pulled a legal pad toward her instead and started writing. Dates and section numbers. The shorthand of a woman working a problem she took seriously. "I need to pull the county's plat records to confirm the current status," Sarah said. "If this deed was never superseded, never reconveyed, never rolled into a later trust or transfer, then legally that 40 acres and everything on it has belonged to you, personally, independent of Carl's estate. This whole time. It wouldn't be part of what your children are dividing at all. It was never his to leave you in the will. It was already yours." Marion sat with that for a long moment. 63 years of being Carl Tanner's wife. For every one of those years, unknown to her, she had also quietly been Louise Marion Dietz, sole owner of 40 acres her own son had just called worthless. "There's more?" Marion said, and pushed the coffee can across the desk. Sarah pried the lid and looked inside. Her eyebrows went up at the silver dollars, though she didn't touch them. 53 of these, Marion said. "I counted them last night. One for every year we were married." "That's not evidence," Sarah said gently. "That's a love letter. That's..." Marion had to look away a moment at that, out the office window, at the courthouse square, until her eyes stopped stinging enough to speak again. "Give me a week," Sarah said. "I want to pull the original plat book myself, not just the digitized records. Sometimes the scans miss a marginal note, or an amendment stapled to the back page. I also want to check whether this parcel has come up in any recent survey activity, any lease inquiries, anything that would explain why somebody might suddenly care what's out there." Marion thought of the white truck at the fence line, the men in orange vests, the pink flags and ground her son was trying to sell. "Funny you should ask," she said, and told her about it. Sarah's pen stopped moving. "Barrett Aggregate. That's a gravel and construction materials outfit. Does contract work for 2 counties worth of highway projects. If they're surveying near your family's bottomland, that usually means they're scouting for material rights, gravel, limestone, sometimes deeper mineral leases, before making an offer. Companies like that don't survey ground they aren't seriously interested in. It costs money to send a crew out." "Interested in the bottomland my son's already got listed?" "Maybe," Sarah said, "or maybe interested in the ground next to it. I'll find out." She capped her pen. "One more thing, Mrs. Tanner. Does anyone besides me and you know you found this deed?" Marion thought of Ollie Krantz, mowing grass around a house that, as far as she now understood, he had somehow known was worth keeping decent all along. "There's a man," she said slowly. "Worked for Carl 40 years. He's been cutting that grass out there for free. Or so I thought. When I asked him about it yesterday, he said the house pays its own way. I didn't understand what he meant." I think you should talk to him again, Sarah said, carefully, before you talk to your children about any of this. Marion drove home that evening past the bottomland a second time. The survey truck was gone, but the pink flags remained, fluttering in rows along the fence line, like something had already been decided out there, quietly, while the family argued over paper plates and grave dirt. She found Ollie the next morning at his own place, a small clapboard house on the edge of town, where he'd lived alone since his wife passed a dozen years back. His yard was as neat and mowed as the abandoned Tanner farmhouse he tended for no visible reason. Ollie, she said, standing on his porch with the coffee can under one arm, I need you to tell me the truth about something. He looked at the can. Something in his face went careful. The way a man's face goes when he's been waiting a long time for a question he half hoped would never come, and half hoped would. That's the coins, he said. It wasn't a question. You knew about them. Carl asked me to check on that house every couple weeks. Keep the grass down, keep an eye on the roof. Make sure nobody was squatting or scrapping the copper out of the walls. Been doing it 11 years. He paid me for it too. Regular, out of a separate account he kept just for that property. Not the farm account, not the household account. A third one, just for Chalk Hollow. Why would he need a third account for a house he let fall apart? Ollie was quiet a moment, working something over. Carl wasn't a man who let things fall apart by accident, Marion. Whatever that place looked like from the road, he was paying real money, regular, to keep it standing and keep it quiet. A man doesn't do that for scrap tin. Did he ever tell you why? No, ma'am. And I didn't ask. Wasn't my business. Ollie looked out at his own yard a moment. But I'll tell you something he did say once, maybe 8-9 years back, when I asked him straight out why we kept mowing a house nobody lived in. He said, that ground's got more truth buried in it than the rest of this family combined. Someday it's going to need mowing regular, so whoever finds it doesn't have to fight the weeds too. Marion stood on that porch a long moment, the coffee can heavy under her arm. The 53 silver dollars inside it suddenly felt less like sentiment, more like a man who had spent a decade quietly guarding a fact he knew. Someday, his wife alone would need. Thank you, Ollie, she said. Keep mowing it. I'll cover the account myself now. Didn't figure I'd need to ask, Ollie said. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She went back to the farmhouse that afternoon by herself. No earring to look for this time. Just the need to stand again in the kitchen where she'd found the can. The loose floorboard sat where she'd left it, propped against the wall. She knelt again at the gap in the subfloor, running her hand along the edges the way she had 2 days before, checking for anything she might have missed in her hurry. Her fingers found a second seam, deeper in the gap, along the joist itself. A narrow strip of wood had been notched and fitted with a small brass hinge, so worn with age it had gone the colour of an old penny. She had missed it entirely the first time, focused only on the can. Now, with steadier hands, she worked the hinge. It opened onto a second, smaller compartment, cut directly into the joist, barely large enough for a folded stack of paper. Inside sat a single sheet, more recent than the deed, the paper still white rather than yellowed, folded in thirds like a letter meant to be mailed. It was a lease offer, typed and dated, from Barrett Aggregate Materials, addressed not to Carl Tanner and not to the Tanner family estate, but to the owner of record, Louise M. Dietz, or her heirs and assigns, proposing a 10-year mineral and aggregate extraction lease on the Chalk Hollow parcel. The terms, even reading the numbers cold, made Marion sit back hard against the kitchen cabinets. The offer was dated 8 weeks before Carl died. Marion brought both documents back to Sarah Fenn the next morning. This time, Sarah did not go quiet reading them. She spoke, and what she said out loud made Marion grip the arm of her chair. $412,000, Sarah said, tapping the lease terms with one finger. Over the 10-year term, at these extraction rates, that's what Barrett Aggregate is offering for rights to that 40 acres. Not to buy the land outright, just to lease the gravel and limestone under it. She looked up. Mrs. Tanner, do you know what your son's bottomland parcel is listed for? Denise put a sign up. 365,000, I believe. So the ground everyone's fighting over, the good farm, the equipment, all of it. And the piece your family called worthless and handed you as an afterthought is worth more on its own, just in a mineral lease, than the entire parcel they're trying to sell. Sarah sat back. Carl knew this. He had to have known it. This offer came directly to him, or to whoever the county, had on file as owner of record 8 weeks before he passed. Somebody at Barrett Aggregate did their homework and found your name on that old deed before your own family ever thought to look. Why wouldn't he tell me? Sarah considered the question a long moment. I can't say for certain, but men like your husband, from what my father used to say about the old farmers in this county, they don't always explain themselves while they're still standing. Sometimes the plan is the inheritance, sometimes leaving you to find it yourself, on your own two knees, in your own time is the whole point. He wasn't hiding it from you forever, Mrs. Tanner. He was making sure it would still be there when you needed it most, and that nobody else could talk you out of it first. Marion thought about that on the drive home. She thought about 53 anniversaries. One line said only once, on a porch, with cheap champagne. A decade of quiet payments to a foreman who mowed grass around a secret. She did not cry in the car. She had done most of her crying already, alone at her own kitchen table in the dark. There was work left to do that crying would only slow down. Wade called that Sunday, inviting her to dinner at his and Denise's place. The kind of invitation that arrived less like an offer and more like a summons. Marion went. She had learned, over 53 years, that refusing an invitation from Wade only bought her a longer conversation about why she'd refused it. She had neither the patience nor the appetite for that particular argument this week. Dinner was pot roast. Denise talked through most of it about the Springfield Realtors' latest showing. A couple from out of state had toured the bottomland twice already and seemed, in Denise's telling, ready to make an offer above asking. They love the frontage on the county road, Denise said. Realtor says it's the kind of parcel that doesn't sit on the market long, this close to the highway project. What highway project? Marion asked, keeping her voice as flat and unremarkable as she could manage. Oh, there's talk of widening Route 60 through the county in the next 5 years, Wade said, spooning more potatoes onto his plate without looking up. Realtor thinks it'll push land values up along the corridor. Good timing for us, honestly. Sell now while interest is high, before the rest of the county catches on and prices creep. Marion filed that too. A highway project. A gravel company already surveying the adjoining ground. A lease offer worth more than the sale everyone was racing to close. She said nothing, only nodded and passed the rolls. How's the old place? Denise asked, not quite looking at her. The question tossed out with the same idle cruelty as the funeral luncheon line, dressed up now as polite dinner conversation. Chalk Hollow, I mean. You getting out there at all, or is it just sitting? I've been out a few times, Marion said, cleaning it up a little. Bless you for even trying, Denise said with a small laugh that had no warmth in it at all. Honestly, Marion, if it were me, I'd just let the county take it for back taxes and be done with it. Save yourself the trouble. That place isn't worth what it'd cost to fix the roof, let alone the rest of it. Maybe, Marion said. We could probably talk to our realtor about listing it too if you wanted, Wade offered, in the tone of a man doing his mother a favour. Even a wreck like that, somebody might take it off your hands for the land value alone. Save you from having to think about it. I'll think about it, Marion said, and reached for her water glass so she wouldn't have to say anything else for a moment. She drove home that night turning the dinner over in her mind, every careless word of it. The highway project, the realtor's confidence, Denise's little laugh about the county taking the land for back taxes. Underneath all of it, invisible to everyone at that table but her, a lease offer worth $412,000, folded inside a coffee can under a kitchen floor 3 miles up the road. She called Sarah first thing Monday morning. I need you to also check something for me, Marion said. My son owes money. I don't know exact figures, but I've heard enough over the years, comments here and there, to know the grain operation hasn't done well the last few seasons. Can you find out if there's a lien or a note against any of what they're trying to sell? Sarah was quiet a moment on the line. That's public record too. In most cases, if it's recorded against the property. Give me a few days. It took Sarah 4. She called Marion on a Thursday evening. Her voice was careful, the way someone sounds when they are about to hand over something heavier than they expected to find. Your son has an operating loan against the farm equipment and a portion of the bottomland. $184,000 outstanding, 3 years behind on the kind of yields that would have paid it down on schedule. The bank's note includes a clause allowing them to call the loan due if there's a change in the underlying collateral's ownership status, without proper notice. That's a fairly standard clause, But it matters here because of one more thing I found. Sarah paused. Your son has already told his loan officer, in writing, in an email the bank produced when I made a formal inquiry through the probate court, that he intends to fold the chalk hollow parcel into the estate's collateral once probate closes. Regardless of what the will says about your inheritance, he's already promised the bank land that legally was never his to promise. Marion sat with the phone against her ear a long moment, looking out her kitchen window at the dark yard where Carl used to keep a garden, listening to the quiet hum of a house that had, for 11 weeks now, been entirely her own to sit in and think. He doesn't know about the deed, she said finally. No, Sarah said. As far as I can tell, nobody in your family knows. Not your son, not Denise, not your other children. Which means, Mrs. Tanner, you're the only person currently aware that the parcel your son has promised his bank was never his to promise at all. What do I do with that? For now, nothing, Sarah said. I've confirmed the deed is clean, recorded properly, never superseded by any later transfer, never rolled into Carl's estate or the family trust his father set up back in the 80s. It's yours, has been yours since 1961. No court is going to say otherwise. I want to finish pulling the original plat book records myself before we do anything more, just to be airtight. Because when this comes out, and it will have to come out, I want there to be no question at all about who owns that ground. And the highway project, the gravel lease, those are your decisions to make once ownership is settled, not before, Sarah said. But Mrs. Tanner, I'll tell you plainly, because you've been plain with me, if that lease offer is still live, and if the highway corridor talk is real, you are sitting on ground worth considerably more than everything else your family is currently fighting over combined. And they have no idea. Marion thanked her and hung up the phone. She sat a long while in her quiet kitchen, thinking not about the money, not really, but about a decade of a foreman mowing grass for no visible reason, a coffee can of silver dollars, one for every year of a marriage, a man who had loved her enough to make absolutely certain that when the day came that his family forgot her, she would already own the ground beneath their feet. Sarah Fenn spent the better part of 2 weeks in the basement of the Barrett County Courthouse, working through plat books that hadn't been pulled off their shelf in years, the pages gone soft and faintly musty, the ink in places faded to a pale brown. She called Marion twice during that stretch, each time with a small new piece confirmed, a margin note here, a cross-reference there. On a Tuesday afternoon, she asked Marion to come in so she could lay it all out at once. I want to walk you through exactly what I found, Sarah said, spreading photocopies across her desk in careful rows. Because when this comes out in front of your family, I want you to be able to answer any question they throw at you without hesitation. She tapped the first page. The 1961 deed, recorded April the 14th. Barrett County, Book 118, page 203. Grantor was your father, Harold Dietz, conveying the chalk hollow parcel to you as a wedding gift, ahead of your marriage to Carl. This was fairly common practice back then, a father settling land on a daughter before her wedding, especially in families with some means, so the daughter would always have something in her own name, regardless of what happened in the marriage. My father never told me, Marion said. He died when I was 31. If he explained it to anyone, it would have been Carl. That fits with what I found next. Sarah moved to the second page. There's a margin annotation on the recorded deed, added later in 1967, referencing a private agreement between your father and Carl. I tracked down the underlying document in the county's miscellaneous records index. Your father made Carl promise in writing, witnessed and notarized, that the chalk hollow parcel would remain in your name, solely for the duration of your marriage and beyond, regardless of any future family trust, will, or estate planning Carl might do with the rest of his own land. Carl signed it. Your father wanted to be certain, even after he was gone, that his daughter would always have ground of her own. Marion sat with that a long moment. Something settled in her chest that had been unsettled since the day of the funeral luncheon. So Carl didn't hide this from me out of some scheme of his own. He was keeping a promise to my father. That's exactly what it looks like, Sarah said, and he kept it for 63 years, through raising 3 children, through building the working farm, through every family trust his own father set up in the 80s, which I also checked, and which never once touched this parcel. Carl kept your father's promise so completely that even you didn't know it existed, until a floorboard gave way under your hand. Why now, though? Why did he never just tell me, once he knew he was dying? Sarah considered that carefully. I can't answer for a dead man's heart, Mrs. Tanner, but I'll tell you what I think, for whatever it's worth. I think he knew exactly what would happen the day he was gone. I think he knew your children would divide the visible wealth fast and cleanly, the way families do when grief makes people practical, before it makes them kind. And I think he wanted you to have something no argument, no lawyer, no family meeting could take away from you. Something so solid in the public record that by the time anyone thought to question it, it would already be settled fact. He wasn't protecting a secret. He was protecting you from ever having to fight for it. Marion thought of Ollie Krantz's words on his own porch. The ground had more truth buried in it than the rest of the family combined. She understood now that Carl had meant it plainly. Not as a riddle, but as an instruction, meant for a woman patient enough to eventually find it on her knees. There's one more thing, Sarah said, and pulled a final sheet from the stack. This one, newer, crisp, printed rather than handwritten. I contacted Barrett Aggregate directly, identifying myself as your attorney, to confirm the lease offer found in the farmhouse is still active. It is. The company's land agent told me they've been trying to reach the owner of record for months, ever since Carl passed and their letters addressed to him started coming back unanswered. They have no idea Carl is deceased. They have no idea who Louise Marion Dietz even is. They simply have 40 acres flagged in their system as a priority acquisition target. Because of proximity to both the confirmed highway corridor expansion and an existing limestone seam they've already tested on adjoining land. The bottomland, Marion said slowly. The bottomland, Sarah confirmed. Your son's parcel sits directly beside a limestone deposit Barrett Aggregate has already leased mineral rights to from a neighbouring landowner. Your 40 acres, the ones everybody called worthless, happen to sit on the better half of that same seam, closer to the road, easier to access, legally clean, with a single owner, no complicated multi-heir estate to negotiate through. From a mining company's perspective, Mrs. Tanner, your husband's forgotten farmhouse is the single most valuable piece of ground in this entire estate. Marion drove home that evening past the bottomland one more time, past Denise's confident red sign, past the pink survey flag still fluttering along the fence line. For the first time since Carl's funeral, she did not feel like a woman standing outside her own family's decisions, waiting to be told what she'd been left. She felt instead like a woman finally holding the one card nobody else at that table knew existed. Curtis called her 2 nights later, the youngest, the one who only came home for funerals and Christmas photos. He sounded distracted on the phone, the way he always did. Like his life in Springfield left him only half his attention to spare for calls to Redbud Crossing. Wade says you might list the old place, Curtis said. The Chalk Hollow house. Says you could split whatever it brings. Help even things out a little, since you got stuck with the worst parcel. Did he say that? Split it? Something like that. You know Wade always trying to smooth things over so nobody stays mad too long. Curtis paused. You doing okay out there, Mum? Diane says you've been driving out to that old place a lot lately. I'm doing fine, Curtis, Marion said, and found that she meant it more than she had in weeks. I've just been getting reacquainted with a few things your father left behind that nobody else bothered to look for. That's good, Curtis said, in the vague way of a son who wasn't really listening, already moving on to the next thing on his mind. Well, let us know if you decide to sell. Wade's realtor could probably get you something for it, even as rough as it is. I'll let you know, Marion said, and meant that too, though not in the way Curtis assumed. She hung up and sat for a while at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd counted 53 silver dollars under better light. She thought about how easily her children had all, without ever quite saying so out loud, decided the Chalk Hollow parcel's only value lay in whatever small check it might eventually cut them, once she gave up and sold it cheap. Not one of them had asked what she wanted to do with it. Not one of them had asked why she kept driving out there at all. She called Sarah the next morning. I want to know exactly how this gets handled properly, Marion said. Not quietly. Not in a private conversation over dinner where Wade can talk his way around it. I want it done the way Carl would have wanted it done. Everything in the open, in front of everyone, on the record. So there's no question afterward, and no room for anybody to pretend they didn't understand. Sarah was quiet a moment on the line. When she spoke again, there was something like respect in her voice, that hadn't been there before. There's a mechanism for that, she said. Probate isn't fully closed yet on Carl's estate. There's still a final accounting hearing scheduled, 3 weeks out, where the court reviews the distribution before it's finalised. Your children will all be there, along with their attorney, since they're formalising the farm and equipment transfer at the same session. If you want, I can file notice ahead of that hearing that a separately owned parcel has come to light, one never part of the estate to begin with, and request the court address it on the record at that same session. Do it, Marion said. I want to be in that room when it's read. You'll need to bring the deed, the plat book confirmation, and I'd recommend the lease offer too, so the court understands the full context, not just the ownership question. Sarah paused. Mrs. Tanner, I want to be honest with you. Once this is filed, your son will know before the hearing. These things get served. There's a notice period. He'll see it coming. Good, Marion said. Let him see it coming. He's had plenty of chances to ask me a single question about that house, instead of deciding for me what it was worth. Wade showed up at her door 6 days later, at 7 in the evening, without calling first, which he almost never did. Marion saw his truck pull in from the kitchen window. She had time to set down her tea before he was knocking. Mom, Wade said when she opened the door. She could see the notice folded in his hand, the paper already soft at the crease from being read and reread in a truck cab. What is this? Come in, Wade. He didn't sit. He stood in her front hallway, the notice held out like it might explain itself if he just presented it properly. This says there's a parcel, the Chalk Hollow property, that's separately owned, outside the estate. It says you're asking the court to formally recognise prior ownership. Mum, what is going on? Sit down, Wade, Marion said again, and I'll tell you. He sat eventually at her kitchen table. The same table. Marion set the deed in front of him, and the plat book photocopies. She let him read it himself instead of summarising it for him, the way she'd spent 53 years summarising hard things, so the people around her wouldn't have to sit with the raw version. Wade read the deed twice. She watched something move behind his eyes as he did. The particular kind of arithmetic a man does when a number he'd already spent in his head turns out to belong to somebody else. This is dated 1961, he said finally. Before you married Dad, Grandpa Dietz gave it to me as a wedding gift. There's a private agreement too, one your father signed, promising to keep it in my name no matter what happened to the rest of his estate. He kept that promise for 63 years, Wade, even from me, until I found it myself under a floorboard, looking for an earring. Why didn't he tell any of us? Why didn't he tell you? I've asked myself that same question more nights than I can count, Marion said. The lawyer thinks he wanted it to be settled fact by the time anyone thought to argue about it. I think he knew his own children well enough to know that if he told us all together, in a room, somebody would have found a reason to talk their mother out of holding on to it. Wade's jaw tightened at that, though he didn't argue the point directly. Mum, this isn't just the house. There's a lease offer in here. $400,000. 412, Marion said. Over 10 years. That's more than the whole bottomland parcel is worth. Wade's voice had gone thin. The particular thinness of a man watching a plan come apart faster than he can find words for it. Denise already has a buyer close to signing. We were counting on that closing to cover the operating note on the equipment. If this parcel gets pulled out of the estate now, the bank's going to want to know why the collateral picture changed. I imagine they will, Marion said. She did not soften it. She had spent 11 weeks softening things for people who had never once softened anything for her. You knew about the loan, Wade said. It wasn't quite an accusation, more the sound of a man realising his mother had known more than he'd given her credit for. I found out, Marion said. The same week I found out you'd already told your bank the Chalk Hollow parcel would be folded into your collateral. Before probate had even closed, before anybody asked me a single question about what I wanted done with it. Wade didn't answer that. He looked down at the deed on the table instead, at his own grandfather-in-law's signature from a year before he was born, at a promise made across 2 generations that had somehow outlasted every plan he'd built on the assumption his mother's inheritance was small, quiet, and settled. What happens now? He asked finally. Now the court confirms what's already true, Marion said, at the hearing in 3 weeks, in front of everyone. I'm not doing this to punish you, Wade. I'm doing it because your father spent 63 years protecting something for me, and I intend to finish what he started. out in the open, the way he would have wanted it done eventually. And the lease? The highway money? That's mine to decide, Marion said. Same as the bottom land was always yours to try and sell, whether or not you asked me first. Wade left without finishing his coffee. Marion watched his truck pull out of the driveway. It sat a long moment at the end of the road before it turned, like a man deciding whether to go somewhere else first. She wondered not unkindly whether he was driving to see Denise, or his own lawyer, or simply driving to have somewhere to put the feeling that had just landed on him. Word travels fast in a town the size of Redbud Crossing. By the following Wednesday, the ladies of the Methodist Auxiliary already knew some version of the story. Filtered and reshaped the way small-town news always is by the time it reaches the church basement. Marion went to the weekly quilting circle out of habit more than enthusiasm. She expected sideways glances and careful prying questions. Instead, Helen Prather simply reached over and squeezed her hand once, hard, without a word, before going back to her stitching. Helen had known Marion since the two of them were girls in the same Sunday school class, 60-odd years back. Heard you found something out at the old place, Helen said eventually, needle steady, eyes on her work. Heard it's got the whole family in an uproar, something like that, Marion allowed. Good, Helen said simply. Lord knows that family's had the run of things long enough without anybody checking their arithmetic. She glanced up, just briefly. Carl was a good man, Marion, whatever else people want to make of this. Man doesn't spend a decade quietly protecting his wife's future without loving her plainly. You remember that, whatever the rest of them say to you before this is done. The other women murmured agreement around the quilting frame. None of them pressed for details Marion wasn't offering. Marion sat among them a long while, needle moving slow and steady through fabric that had passed through this same church basement for 3 generations of Redbud Crossing women. She felt for the first time since the funeral something like being held up by more hands than just her own. Ollie stopped by her house himself, unannounced, 2 days before she was due back at Sarah's office with the Platt book findings. He carried a small tin of the peppermints Carl used to keep in his truck. Same brand, same tin. A detail so specific and unprompted that Marion had to sit down at her own kitchen table before she could properly thank him for it. Wasn't sure if you'd want these, Ollie said, setting the tin down carefully. Found a case of them in the barn out at Chalk Hollow, back of an old cabinet. Must have been sitting there years. Carl always did keep more of everything than he ever let on, tucked away where a person wouldn't think to look unless they already knew. That seems to be the theme of the month, Marion said, and managed something close to a real laugh. The first one in weeks. Figured you could use the reminder that he was always thinking ahead, Ollie said, even in the small things. Man wasn't complicated, Marion. Not really. He just believed in doing right by people quietly, and letting the doing speak instead of the telling. Some men are built that way. Rarer than you'd think. Marion kept the tin on her kitchen counter after that, refilling it herself when it ran low, a small unspoken tribute that made the house feel a little less empty. Each morning she reached for one. Denise called the next afternoon. Her voice had none of the idle cruelty of the dinner table in it now, just a kind of careful, calculated warmth Marion recognised immediately as fear wearing a pleasant coat. Marion, I think there's been some misunderstanding, Denise said, about the Chalk Hollow property. Wade mentioned something about a deed, but I'm sure once the lawyers look at everything properly, we can find an arrangement that's fair to everyone. Family should stick together on things like this. Funny, Marion said. I don't recall you mentioning family sticking together when you put a sale sign on the bottom land before the funeral flowers had wilted. The silence on the line told her Denise hadn't expected that particular memory to be raised back at her. I know what you meant, Denise, Marion said gently enough. She had no interest in cruelty even now. Only in being finally completely clear. You meant the good land was worth fighting over and the old house wasn't worth a phone call to ask me how I was holding up. I understand. I've understood for a while now. I'll see you both at the hearing. She hung up before Denise could answer. Setting the phone down, she found that her hands were steady in a way they hadn't been since the funeral luncheon, since the moment she'd handed Delacroix her reading glasses and smiled through an announcement that had cut her clean in front of 40 people holding paper plates. Diane, her daughter, called that same evening. Her voice carried none of Wade's alarm or Denise's careful fear. Only a kind of quiet, guilty softness Marion hadn't expected. Mom, is it true? About the deed? It's true. I didn't know, Diane said. I want you to know that. I didn't agree to any of what Wade said at the funeral, about the house being worth nothing. I just didn't say anything because that's what I do. I just don't say anything. And I've been feeling sick about it for weeks now. Marion thought of her own reflection in that. A woman who had spent 53 years smoothing other people's stumbles and staying quiet through her own. Something softened toward her daughter that she hadn't expected to feel that evening. I know, sweetheart, Marion said. I did the same thing myself for longer than you've been alive. It's all right. What matters now is what happens at that hearing. I'd like you there standing next to me if you're willing. I'll be there, Diane said. Whatever you need. Curtis called 2 days after that, later than his brother and sister, which did not surprise Marion. Curtis had always been the child slowest to notice a storm until it was already raining on him. Wade told me about the deed, Curtis said, his voice tight in a way she rarely heard from her easygoing youngest son. He's pretty shaken up, Mum. Says the bank's asking questions about the loan now. I imagine they are, Marion said. I'm not calling to take his side, Curtis said quickly. I guess I'm trying to understand how this all fits together. You've got a deed from before you married Dad. You've had it this whole time and never knew. Dad knew and never told you. It's a lot to take in from 200 miles away over a phone call. It was a lot to take in from 6 feet away, in my own kitchen too, Marion said. You don't get a head start just because you were far off. Curtis laughed at that, a short, surprised sound. The first real laugh Marion had heard from him since Carl's funeral. Fair enough. Look, Mum, whatever happens at the hearing, I want you to know I'm not upset about any of it. If anything, I think it's kind of remarkable. Grandpa Dietz doing that for you. Dad keeping it all these years. That's its own kind of love story when you think about it. I've been thinking about it a great deal, Marion said. More than almost anything else in my life. This past month. You deserve it, you know, Curtis said, quieter now. I don't say that enough. Probably don't say much of anything enough, living so far off the way I do. But you deserve to have something that's just yours, Mum. You spent your whole life making sure the rest of us had what we needed. It's not selfish to hold on to this. Marion had to sit with the phone a moment before she trusted her voice enough to answer. Thank you, Curtis. That means more than you probably know. I'll be there for the hearing, he said, flying up early that morning. Wouldn't miss it. She thanked him and hung up. She sat at her kitchen table a while longer. Grief has a strange way of finally sorting people, showing you plainly, in the space of a few weeks, which of your children reach first for fear, and which reach first for you. Which ones, given a little time and a little honesty, are capable of doing both, and eventually choosing the second. Marion spent the final week before the hearing out at the farmhouse most afternoons, not searching for anything more, just sitting in the kitchen with the loose floorboards set carefully back in place. The coffee can returned to its hiding spot for safekeeping. Everything photographed and documented and copied a dozen times over, at Sarah's insistence. She cleared brush from the porch. She swept the front room. She stood in the doorway some evenings and watched the light come long and gold across the sumac at the tree line. The same sumac Carl had let grow wild for a decade, while he quietly paid a foreman to keep the rest of the place from falling into total ruin. She understood finally, standing there, what Ollie had meant about the ground having more truth buried in it than the rest of the family combined. It wasn't the coins, it wasn't even the deed. It was a man who had loved her enough to spend the last decade of his life protecting a promise nobody else knew he was keeping, so that on the day his family forgot her, the ground itself would not. Sarah called 4 days before the hearing. This time her voice carried a tightness Marion hadn't heard from her before. Garrity filed something late yesterday, Sarah said, a motion challenging the authenticity of the 1967 agreement, the one where Carl promised your father he'd keep the parcel in your name. He's arguing the signature doesn't match other known samples of Carl's handwriting from that period. He's requesting a handwriting expert be allowed to examine it before the hearing proceeds. Is that serious? It's a delay tactic more than anything, Sarah said. The deed itself isn't in question. It's recorded, unassailable. But if he can cast doubt on the 1967 agreement, he can argue Carl never truly affirmed the arrangement. That muddies the water, even though it doesn't actually change who holds title. Judges don't love muddy water 48 hours before a hearing. I need to shore this up fast. What do you need from me? Anything that corroborates Carl knew about this arrangement and treated it as real in his own conduct over the years, something beyond the paper itself. Marion thought of Ollie Krantz immediately and drove to his place that same afternoon. They're saying Carl might not have really signed that 1967 paper, she told him, standing again on his porch, the autumn light going low and orange behind her. Wade's lawyer wants to bring in an expert to argue the signature's no good. Ollie's face darkened in a way Marion hadn't seen from him before, a flash of something like anger under all that careful 82-year-old patience. "That's a damned lie," Ollie said. "Pardon my language, Marion, but it is. Carl showed me that very agreement himself years back, when he first asked me to start looking after the place regular. Told me straight out what it was and why it mattered. Said your father had made him swear to it before the wedding even happened. Said he intended to keep that promise till the day he died, which he did. I watched him sign a duplicate of it once for his own records, must have been 9 years ago, when he redid his file cabinet after a water leak got into the old one. I stood right there in his study while he signed it. Would you say that in a courtroom, Ollie? I'd say it standing on my own grave if it meant setting the record straight for you," Ollie said. "Man doesn't spend 40 years working for somebody and then let a fool lawyer call him a liar after he's in the ground." Sarah filed Ollie's sworn statement the next morning, along with a duplicate copy of the 1967 agreement, the one Ollie remembered Carl keeping in his own study. Marion found it, after an evening of searching, in a fireproof lockbox in the back of Carl's closet, one she had not opened since his death, tucked beside his old service medals and a stack of cancelled checks going back decades. The duplicate matched the courthouse copy exactly. Signed in the same hand, on the same date, notarized by a different witness than the original. That made the challenge to its authenticity considerably harder to sustain. Garrity's handwriting expert, when Sarah finally got him on the phone 2 days before the hearing, backed off his initial opinion once shown the duplicate and Ollie's statement. He conceded in an email that the second, independently witnessed copy strongly supported the signature's authenticity. Sarah forwarded that email to Marion the evening before the hearing, with a single line of her own added at the top. "This is the ball game, Mrs. Tanner. Get some sleep." Marion did not entirely manage the sleep part. She lay awake a long while that night, thinking about a decade of quiet mowing, a fireproof lockbox she'd never once thought to open. A foreman who had loved his old boss enough to remember, word for word, a conversation from 9 years back, at the exact moment it mattered most. There was one more piece of trouble waiting for her that same week. It arrived by certified mail, 2 days before the hearing, from the bank holding Wade's operating note. The letter was addressed jointly to Wade, and, curiously to Marion, as a listed contact on file. It indicated the bank had grown aware of the pending ownership dispute over the Chalk Hollow parcel, and was reviewing whether the change in the underlying collateral picture constituted a material default under the loan's terms. That could trigger an immediate call of the full outstanding balance. Marion read the letter twice at her kitchen table. She understood for the first time just how completely her son had built his own financial house, on ground that was never his. She felt, despite everything, not triumph at the news, but a tired, complicated ache she recognised as simple maternal worry, the kind that outlives even justified anger. She called Sarah about the letter, half expecting to be told there was nothing to be done. Instead, she heard something in Sarah's voice that sounded almost like a plan already forming. "That letter isn't really about you," Sarah said. "It's the bank protecting itself, and frankly, it's useful. Once the court confirms your ownership at the hearing, the collateral question resolves itself one way or another, cleanly on the record, instead of dragging out for months in ambiguity. It's better for everyone, including your son, to have this settled fast rather than left hanging over his note indefinitely. Even if settling it fast means the bank calls his loan, that's between Wade and the bank," Sarah said. "It was always going to be between Wade and the bank, the moment he promised them ground he didn't own. I know that's hard to hear about your own son, Mrs. Tanner, but you're not the one who put that clause in his contract. You're not the one who told the loan officer the parcel would be his collateral before probate even closed. He did that on his own, weeks before you ever found the floorboard." Marion thanked her and hung up. She sat a long while longer at her table, thinking not about money or courtrooms, but about a boy she'd raised on egg money and patience, who had somehow grown into a man who built promises on ground he never bothered to ask about. Wondering, not for the first time that week, whether there had been some moment, some small overlooked morning decades back, when she might have taught him differently. Wade came to see her once more, the night before the hearing, alone this time. Without Denise, without the folded notice in his hand. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. I talked to Garrity, Wade said, standing again in her front hallway, not sitting this time. He says even with Ollie's statement, even with the duplicate agreement, we could still drag this out. File appeals. Make it cost you time and money you don't necessarily want to spend at your age, fighting your own children in court for months. Is that a threat, Wade, or an apology? He flinched at that, just slightly. It's neither. It's me asking one more time whether there's a way to settle this quietly, between us, before tomorrow. Denise thinks if we offered you a percentage, something fair, everybody could walk away from this without it becoming a public spectacle at the courthouse. A percentage, Marion repeated, of my own land, of the lease money, the gravel rights. We're not asking for the house itself, Mum. Just Wade. Marion said his name quietly, the way she used to when he was small and about to do something he'd regret. Your father spent 63 years keeping a promise to my father that this ground would be mine, free and clear, no matter what happened to the rest of his estate. He didn't do that so that the first time it mattered, I'd hand pieces of it away to smooth things over at a family dinner. I'm not doing that. Not because I don't love you, because I finally understand what he was protecting. And I'm not going to be the one who lets it slip through my fingers a second time, just to keep the peace. So tomorrow, in that courtroom, in front of Denise, in front of Curtis, you're going to make this as public as possible. I'm going to let the truth be read out loud, Marion said. That's all I've asked for from the beginning. If it feels public to you, Wade, that's because you and Denise made your first move about that house public too. Over paper plates, in front of 40 people, the same week your father was buried. I didn't choose that stage. You did. I'm only choosing to finally speak on it. Wade didn't have an answer for that. He stood in her hallway a long moment. Marion watched something shift behind his eyes. Not quite acceptance. Not yet. But the first crack of a man realising the story he'd been telling himself about his own fairness might not survive being said out loud in a room full of witnesses. I loved him too, you know, Wade said finally, quieter than she'd heard him speak in years. Dad, I know it might not look like it, the way I've handled all this, but I loved him, and I thought I was doing right by this family. I know you did, Marion said, and found she meant it, even now. That's the hardest part of all this, Wade. You're not a villain in some story. You're a tired man who inherited a farm and a debt at the same time. You made choices under that pressure that weren't fair to me. Tomorrow those choices are going to catch up with you in a courtroom. None of that erases that you loved your father, or that some part of you still loves your mother, even standing here arguing with her about a coffee can full of silver dollars. He left without saying much more. Marion stood a long while at her own front door after his taillights disappeared down the road. She felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just told her own son the truth and watched him leave without quite being able to accept it yet. She called Sarah one final time that night, mostly just to hear a steady voice before the morning came. Are you ready? Sarah asked. I keep telling people I am, Marion said, and each time I say it, it gets a little truer. For what it's worth, Sarah said, in 15 years of practicing law in this county, I've seen a lot of families fight over a lot of things. I don't think I've seen one where the truth was this clean, this well documented, this completely on the right side of a woman who never once raised her voice to get it. Whatever happens tomorrow, Mrs. Tanner, you built this case the same way your husband built that promise, quietly and completely, and long before anybody else thought to look. The morning of the hearing came in grey and still, the kind of Missouri fall morning that couldn't decide between mist and frost. Marion dressed the way she'd dressed for the will reading, the same navy dress, the same low heels she could stand in for hours without her feet complaining. She pinned her hair the way Carl had always liked it, though there was no one left now to notice, except herself. Diane arrived at 7:30 to drive her into town. Marion appreciated the gesture without saying so directly. They both understood that today was not a day to talk much on the drive. You nervous? Diane asked, at a stoplight 2 blocks from the courthouse. No, Marion said, and was a little surprised to find it was true. I was nervous at the funeral. I was nervous the day I found the floorboard. I'm not nervous today. Today I just have to sit in a room and let the truth be read out loud. That part isn't hard. That part's actually the easiest thing I've done in 11 weeks. The Barrett County Courthouse sat on the square, exactly where it had sat Marion's whole life. Limestone gone soft grey with a century of weather. The old clock tower still 5 minutes fast, the way it had been since before she was born. She had been inside it a handful of times. For her marriage licence, for Carl's mother's estate decades back, for a jury summons she'd managed to defer twice. Each time it had felt like a building that belonged to somebody else's important business, not hers. Today it felt different. Today she carried a manila folder with a deed inside it that had been sitting in this exact building's basement, recorded and waiting, for 63 years. The probate courtroom was smaller than Marion remembered, wood-panelled, a scattering of folding chairs along the back wall for anyone who wasn't a direct party. Wade was already there when she arrived. Seated at the front table beside his own attorney, a heavy-set man from Springfield named Garrity. Marion had never met him, but recognised him by reputation as the kind of lawyer families hired when they wanted someone loud on their side. Denise sat behind Wade in the front row of chairs, her expression carefully neutral, in the particular way of a woman who has practiced neutral in a mirror. Curtis had driven up from Springfield the night before. He looked rumpled and uncertain, glancing between his mother and his brother, like he still hadn't decided which version of this story he believed. Sarah Fenn was already at the table, reserved for Marion's side, her folders arranged in the same careful rows Marion had come to recognise from her office. She stood when Marion and Diane came in, guiding them to their seats with a quiet efficiency that steadied something in Marion's chest. "You ready?" Sarah asked quietly, once they were seated. "I've been ready for 63 years, Marion said. I just didn't know it." Judge Corinne Albrecht took the bench a few minutes later, a stern-faced woman in her 60s who had presided over Barrett County probate matters for nearly 2 decades. So the local gossip held she had no patience whatsoever for family theatrics dressed up as legal argument. She reviewed the morning's docket briefly, confirmed the primary business, the formal transfer of the working farm, equipment, and cash accounts to Wade, Diane, and Curtis per the will, already largely uncontested and ready for final approval. "Before we finalise today's distribution," Judge Albrecht said, glancing down at a notice on her desk, "I understand there's a matter regarding a separately owned parcel that needs to be addressed on the record. Ms. Fenn, this is your filing." "It is, Your Honour," Sarah said, standing. "On behalf of Marion Tanner, I'm asking the court to formally confirm that the Chalk Hollow parcel, 40 acres in Section 14 of Redbud Township, along with the farmhouse and outbuildings situated on it, was never part of the decedent's estate to distribute. It has been the separate, individually owned property of Mrs. Tanner, under her maiden name, since April of 1961. Garrity was on his feet almost before Sarah finished. "Your Honour, this is the first my clients have heard of any such claim outside of a notice filed 6 days ago. If there's a competing ownership claim, we'd ask the court to treat this as a contested matter requiring further discovery, not something to be resolved this morning." "It isn't a claim, Counsellor," Sarah said, calm and unhurried in a way that made Marion, watching her, feel something like pride. "It's a recorded fact. I have the original 1961 warranty deed, the corresponding entry from Barrett County, Book 118, page 203. The county's own plat records confirming this parcel was never reconveyed, never rolled into any later family trust, and never became part of Carl Tanner's individual estate. Mr. Tanner's own signature appears on a private 1967 agreement, witnessed and notarized, confirming his understanding that the property would remain his wife's alone. I'd ask the court's permission to present these documents now." Garrity tried once more before the judge could rule. "Your Honour, we'd note for the record that opposing counsel's filing includes a supplemental affidavit challenging the authenticity of a supporting document, which was only resolved between counsel this week. We'd ask the court weigh that history in assessing how much confidence to place in today's presentation." "Noted, Counsellor," Judge Albrecht said, unmoved, though my understanding as your own retained expert withdrew the challenge in writing once shown additional evidence. Is that correct? Garrity's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's correct, Your Honour. Then I'll allow Ms. Fenn to proceed, and I'll weigh the full record including your expert's withdrawal, same as everything else. Judge Albrecht nodded to Sarah. Ms. Fenn, proceed. Sarah crossed to the clerk's table and entered each document into the record one at a time, narrating them plainly for the transcript, her voice carrying easily in the panelled room. She held up the deed itself last, the paper gone soft and yellow at the folds. She read the grantee's name aloud, slow and clear, so there could be no mistaking it for anyone in that courtroom. To Louise Marion Dietz, Sarah read, her heirs and assigns forever. The following described tract in Section 14, Redbud Township, Barrett County, Missouri, comprising 40 acres more or less, together with all improvements thereon. Recorded April 14th, 1961. Your Honour, Louise Marion Dietz is Marion Tanner's maiden name. She has held sole record title to this parcel for 63 years, since before her marriage to the decedent. The room went still. The particular way a room goes still when something everyone assumed was settled turns out never to have been settled at all. Marion did not look at Wade. She kept her eyes on Sarah, on the deed in her hand, on the plain-type letters that had been waiting in a courthouse basement, her entire married life for someone to finally read them out loud. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I have a private agreement dated 1967, signed by Carl Tanner and witnessed by two parties whose signatures I've verified against the county's notary records. In it, Mr. Tanner acknowledged and affirmed that this parcel would remain his wife's separate property throughout the marriage and beyond, regardless of any estate planning he undertook for the remainder of his holdings. This agreement was made at the request of Mrs. Tanner's father, Harold Dietz, who conveyed the parcel to his daughter as a wedding gift and wished to ensure she would always retain something in her own name. Garrity rose again, though with noticeably less certainty than before. Your Honour, even granting the deed's authenticity, we'd ask whether any subsequent action by the decedent might have altered this arrangement. A later trust, perhaps, or an implied agreement between husband and wife over 60 years of marriage regarding shared property. I anticipated that question, Sarah said, and produced a final folder. I've reviewed the family trust established by Carl Tanner's father in 1984, along with every amendment filed against it through the years. The Chalk Hollow parcel is not referenced anywhere in that trust, nor in any subsequent will or estate document Carl Tanner executed, including the will currently before this court. It was never his to include, because it was never his. Judge Albrecht reviewed the documents herself for a long moment, the courtroom silent except for the soft rustle of paper. Then she looked up, first at Sarah, then at Marion, and finally at Wade. Mrs. Tanner, the judge said, is there anything you'd like to add to the record? Marion stood, smoothing her navy dress with one hand out of an old habit she couldn't quite break. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that surprised even her. Only this, Your Honour, Marion said. My husband told me once, many years ago, on our 10th anniversary, that if this family ever forgot me, the house never would. I thought he was just being sentimental. I understand now he meant it exactly the way he said it. He kept a promise to my father for 63 years, quietly, without ever once telling me, because he wanted to be certain that whatever else happened to this family, I would always have ground of my own to stand on. I'm not here to take anything from my children. The farm, the equipment, the accounts, those were always meant for them, and I'm glad for it. I'm only here so the truth can finally be read out loud, in the same courthouse where my father put it into the record 63 years ago, so that nobody, ever again, calls this parcel worthless in front of me at a funeral luncheon. The room was very quiet after that. Wade sat with his eyes on the table in front of him, his jaw working, and did not look up. Based on the documentation presented, Judge Albrecht said, and finding no evidence of any subsequent conveyance, waiver or inclusion in the decedent's estate, the court confirms that the Chalk Hollow parcel, 40 acres in Section 14, Redbud Township, together with all improvements and appurtenances, including any mineral or extraction rights associated therewith, is and has been the sole separate property of Marion Tanner, formerly Louise Marion Dietz, since April of 1961. This parcel is excluded from the estate distribution and will not be included in today's final accounting. The remainder of the estate, as outlined in the will, is approved for distribution as presented. She set down her pen. Is there anything further from either party? Garrity leaned toward Wade and spoke low. Whatever he said made Wade shake his head once, sharply, before Garrity straightened and addressed the bench. "Nothing further, Your Honour." "Then this matter is concluded," Judge Albrecht said, and moved on to the next item on her docket. The ordinary business of the morning resumed, as though a woman's entire married life hadn't just been quietly, permanently vindicated in the space of 15 minutes. Outside on the courthouse steps in the grey morning light, Wade found her before she could reach the car. He looked older than he had at the funeral luncheon, the certainty gone out of his shoulders. "Mom," he said, "I didn't know. I want you to believe that. I said what I said at the funeral because I genuinely thought that house was worth nothing, and I thought I was doing you a favour by taking the rest off your hands so you wouldn't have to deal with the estate." "I believe you didn't know, Wade," Marion said. "That was never really the problem. The problem was you didn't ask, not about the house, not about what I wanted, not once in 11 weeks. You decided for me the same way you've been deciding things for me since your father got sick, and you called it help." Wade didn't have an answer for that. He stood on the steps a moment, hands in his coat pockets. Marion watched him search for something to say and come up empty, which told her more than any apology could have. "The bank," he said finally. He said, "About the operating loan." "That's between you and the bank, Wade. It was always going to be between you and the bank, whether or not that parcel had ever come to light. You promised them collateral that was never yours to promise. That's not something I did to you. That's something you did to yourself, a long time before I ever found that floorboard." She left him standing there and walked to Diane's car. She did not look back to see whether he watched her go. For the first time in a very long while, it did not matter to her whether he did. The county recorder's office finalised the amended parcel record within the week, formally noting Marion's sole ownership and forwarding a certified copy of the court's order to Barrett Aggregate Materials. The land agent called Sarah's office 2 days later, apologetic and eager, once he understood the ownership question was finally settled, and there was a real, single, willing party to negotiate with. Denise's Springfield realtor pulled the Bottomland listing that same week, quietly, without a public announcement. Once the title company reviewing the pending sale flagged the same collateral question the bank had already raised. The couple who'd toured it twice, ready to make an offer above asking, moved on to another parcel 2 counties over. Marion heard about it secondhand, from Diane, without any particular satisfaction in the hearing of it. She had not wanted Wade to lose the sale. She had only wanted the truth read out loud. The sale, unravelling on its own, from its own bad foundation, felt less like a victory than like weather. Something that happened because of choices made months before she ever found a floorboard. The bank called Wade's operating note due within 30 days, exactly as Sarah had predicted. For a hard, uncertain stretch of autumn, Marion watched her son go through something she recognised all too well from her own life. The particular indignity of a person forced to ask for help they'd never expected to need. He did not come to her for money. She would have given it to him if he had, quietly, without conditions. But some stubborn Tanner pride kept him from asking. Instead, he worked with the bank directly, restructuring the note against a smaller footprint of the working farm, selling off older equipment he could live without, tightening the operation down to something leaner, and, according to Diane, more honest than it had been in years. "He's different," Diane told her mother, over coffee one Sunday in November. The farm business mostly settled by then, the worst of the scramble behind him. Quieter. "He asked me last week whether I thought you'd ever want to come see the harvest numbers, like your opinion actually mattered to how the farm gets run. He never used to ask things like that. Losing something you thought was owed to you does that to a person. Sometimes," Marion said, "if they're willing to let it." Wade came to see her himself in early December, on a cold, clear afternoon. This time he sat when she offered him a chair. He did not bring a folded notice, only a small paper bag from the hardware store in town. "I fixed the roof," he said, setting the bag down. "On the chalk hollow place. Been working on it the last few weekends. Patched the hole over the kitchen. Replaced some of the rotted boards on the porch. Figured since it's actually worth something now, might as well stop letting it fall apart on your account. You didn't have to do that, Wade. I know I didn't." He turned the paper bag over in his hands a moment, not quite looking at her. "I've been thinking a lot since the hearing. About what you said, that I decided things for you instead of asking. I think I've been doing that since Dad got sick, honestly. maybe longer. Diane says I do it to her too. Sometimes. I don't know how to just stop doing something you've been doing your whole life, but I wanted to start somewhere, and fixing that roof felt like somewhere. Marion looked at her son a long moment, at the tired lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, at a man trying, clumsily and late, to hand something back instead of taking it. That's a good place to start, she said. I also wanted to ask, Wade said, whether you'd let me help out there sometimes. Not for anything. Just Ollie's getting up in years, and it's a lot of ground for one old man to mow by himself, and I know how to run a mower same as anybody. Marion thought of Ollie, 82 and still climbing onto that same mower twice a month, out of loyalty to a promise he'd never fully explained until she needed him to. Something in her chest eased at the thought of her own son finally standing beside him, instead of dismissing what they'd both been quietly protecting. I'd like that, Marion said. Ollie could use the company, if nothing else. She drove out to Chalk Hollow the following weekend. The first hard frost of the year silvered the sumac along the drive. She found the roof genuinely fixed, new tin gleaming where the old hole had gaped for years. The porch boards replaced and sturdy under her feet for the first time since Carl's knees had given out on him a decade back. She let herself in through the kitchen door, which no longer stuck the way it always had. She stood a long minute in the room where she'd found the floorboard, where a coffee can of silver dollars and a 63-year-old promise had waited patiently for her to come looking for nothing more than a lost earring. She had used some of the lease proceeds, once the first payment came through, to do what felt right rather than what felt profitable. She'd paid off the remainder of Ollie's back wages. Carl's separate account hadn't quite covered in its final years, with interest he hadn't asked for, and tried, unsuccessfully, to refuse. She'd set aside a portion for Curtis's oldest daughter, a girl studying agriculture at the State University 2 hours north, who'd never once, in all the family arguments over the estate, said an unkind word about the old house, or asked what it might be worth, and she'd kept enough of it, quietly, to finish restoring the farmhouse properly, room by room. Not as an investment, as a place worth walking into again. She signed the 10-year lease with Barrett Aggregate herself, in Sarah's office, on a bright morning in late January. Sarah reviewed every clause aloud before Marion put her name to it. Her real name this time, Marion Louise Tanner, formerly Louise Marion Dietz, both names finally reconciled on the same page for the first time in 63 years. The company's land agent, a courteous younger man named Petrie, shook her hand afterward. He told her, without any particular flattery in it, that theirs was the cleanest, most straightforward acquisition his division had closed in years. No competing heirs, no muddled title, no family squabble to slow down the paperwork. Just one woman with 63 years of patience, and a lawyer who did her homework properly. Funny, Marion told him. Everyone in my family spent months telling me that house was the least valuable thing in the entire estate. With respect, Ma'am, Petrie said, your family was looking at the roof. We were looking at what's underneath it. Those are rarely the same thing. She found her mother's garnet earring 3 weeks after the hearing. Of all things, wedged behind the leg of the kitchen stove, where it must have rolled the very day she lost it. Months of dust had settled over the small red stone until it was nearly the same colour as the floor around it. She held it in her palm a long moment, turning it over, thinking of how she'd walked into this house, looking for exactly this small, ordinary, sentimental thing, and found instead her own name waiting under a floorboard. 63 years. Patient. Exactly where her husband and her father, between the two of them, had made sure it would stay until she was ready. She placed the coffee can of silver dollars on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the afternoon light caught it clean. She did not put it away in a drawer or a safe deposit box, the way Sarah had gently suggested for insurance purposes. Some things, Marion had decided, belonged in plain sight, catching the light, exactly where a person could see them, every morning, and remember what they meant. Ollie still came twice a month to mow, though now Wade came with him more often than not. The two men fell into an easy, wordless rhythm out there, one running the mower along the fence line while the other cleared brush from around the barn. Neither of them saying much, which suited them both fine. Marion had the old tractor in the barn hauled out and restored that winter too. Not to run it, just to have it sitting clean and whole in the yard again. Tyres replaced, seat patched, the fender she'd once run her hand along, free of rust. She had a small plaque made for it. Nothing fancy. Just a brass plate screwed into the frame, reading Carl Tanner, 1961, still standing. She set it where the morning light would find it first each day, right beside the barn door her father-in-law had rebuilt, after his son first drove clean through the wall of it. It was Wade who found the second thing, the week the restorer came for the tractor. He and Ollie were clearing the loft above the old tack room, hauling down decades of baled twine and a rusted seed drill nobody had use for anymore, when Ollie's boot caught a board that gave more than it should have. Wade knelt and pried it up himself, the way he'd watched his mother describe prying up a kitchen floorboard for an earring, though he hadn't fully believed until that moment how easy a thing like that really was. Underneath sat a cigar box, warped soft with age, and inside it 11 savings bonds, made out one at a time across 11 different years, each in the name of a different grandchild. The first dated the spring Diane's oldest was born. Wade carried the box down to the house himself and set it on Marion's kitchen table without a word, because for once he didn't trust his own voice to explain what he'd found. Marion opened it slowly. Ollie stood in the doorway, cap in his hands, saying nothing, the way he'd learned to say nothing, at exactly the moments a person needed quiet more than comfort. $25 a bond, Marion said finally, reading the face value off the oldest one. Back when $25 was a week's groceries for this whole family. He never said a word, Wade said. Not once. 20-some years and not one word. No, Marion said. That was always his way. He built the thing quietly and let somebody else find it when it was time. She closed the lid gently. Emily's is in here, so is your youngest. Wade didn't answer that. He only nodded and went back out to help Ollie finish the loft and left his mother alone a while with the box. Emily photographed the plaque on her phone before she left that spring. Said she wanted to remember exactly how it looked. The brass catching the light. The barn standing solid behind it after a century of patches. Marion thought that was as fitting a tribute as any lawyer's document or courthouse ruling. A girl not yet 20 finding something worth remembering in an old man's rebuilt wall, long after everyone else in the family had first called it worthless. Curtis's oldest daughter, Emily, came home from the state university that spring for a long weekend. Marion invited the whole family out to Chalk Hollow for the first time since the estate had settled. A Sunday dinner on the newly sturdy porch, with folding tables borrowed from the church and a ham Marion had spent all Saturday preparing, the way she used to for holidays when the children were small. Emily arrived early, before the rest of the family, and found Marion in the kitchen, slicing bread. She stood a moment in the doorway looking at the coffee can on the windowsill, catching the afternoon light exactly the way Marion had arranged it to. Dad told me a little about all this, Emily said. The floorboard, the deed, everything. I hope it's all right that I asked him to bring me out here today, instead of just showing up to the family dinner like normal. I wanted to see the house myself, where it all happened. Of course it's all right, Marion said. Come look at the floor if you like. I still keep the board loose, more out of habit than anything else. Emily knelt where Marion showed her. She ran her fingers along the same seam Marion had found by accident, looking for an earring. She looked up with an expression Marion recognised, the particular wide-eyed respect of someone young enough to still find real history startling rather than ordinary. You use part of the money for my school, Emily said. Dad told me that too. I wanted to thank you myself in person, not just over the phone. You never once said an unkind word about this place, Marion said. Not through the whole ugly business of the will and the arguing. Your father tells me you're the one who spoke up for keeping it in the family, back before anybody knew what it was actually worth. That's worth something to me, Emily. More than the tuition, if I'm honest. I just thought it was wrong. Everybody deciding it was worthless before anybody even asked you, Emily said, standing and brushing the dust from her knees. Seemed like an obvious thing to think, honestly. I didn't expect it to matter. It mattered, Marion said. Sometimes the obvious, decent thing is the rarest thing in a room. You'll find that out the older you get. The rest of the family arrived through the afternoon. Diane first, with her husband and their 2 boys, who ran straight for the newly cleared yard and the old rope swing Wade had rehung from the oak by the barn. Curtis and his wife came next, Emily already installed in the kitchen helping Marion with the bread. Wade arrived last, later than everyone, with Denise beside him. Marion watched her daughter-in-law get out of the truck with a covered dish held carefully in both hands. Looking for the first time since Marion had known her, uncertain of her welcome, rather than certain of her opinions. "I brought a peach cobbler," Denise said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps. "I wasn't sure if that was still. I mean, if you'd want me here at all, honestly, after everything." "Bring it up, Denise," Marion said. "There's room on the table." Denise climbed the steps slowly. She set the dish down and stood a moment, looking out at the restored porch, the new tin roof gleaming in the spring sun, the sumac cut back to reveal a clean view down to the creek. Marion hadn't even remembered was there until Wade cleared the brush. "It's beautiful," Denise said, quiet, and there was none of the old idle cruelty in it, just a plain, almost embarrassed honesty. "I never actually saw it, before. I just heard Wade and everyone talk about it as the wreck out past the Goodland, and I never once drove out to look for myself. I'm sorry about that. About the sign, too. Putting it up so fast before things had even settled. That wasn't right of me." "No," Marion agreed. "It wasn't. But you drove out here today and you brought a cobbler, and you're standing on my porch admitting it instead of explaining it away, so I'll take that as a start if you're offering one." "I am," Denise said. "Offering one, I mean." Dinner ran long into the golden part of the evening, the way family dinners sometimes do when nobody's in a hurry to leave. Diane's boys chased fireflies at the tree line as the light went soft. Curtis and Wade sat together on the porch steps in a way Marion hadn't seen the two brothers sit together in years, talking low about the farm's spring planting, and, for once, not about money or blame. Ollie stopped by near sundown, on his way home from mowing the far pasture. Marion insisted he stay for a plate. He sat at the end of the table, telling the grandchildren stories about their grandfather as a young man, stories none of them had heard before. A young Carl Tanner, learning to drive a tractor at 14 and putting it through the side of the old barn, a barn that had stood, patched and rebuilt, on this very ground for nearly a century. Marion sat back in her chair as the evening settled, watching her family, imperfect and recently mended, gathered on a porch that 11 months ago had been sagging and forgotten. She felt something she hadn't let herself feel fully since Carl's death. Not triumph, not vindication exactly. Just a wide, quiet gratitude that the ground beneath all of them had finally been told the truth about itself. Diane found her mother alone in the kitchen near the end of the evening, wrapping the last of the ham in foil for whoever wanted to take some home. She stood a moment in the doorway before speaking. "I keep thinking about what you said, back before the hearing," Diane said, "about how you spent your whole life smoothing other people's stumbles and staying quiet through your own. I've been trying to stop doing that myself, a little at a time. It's harder than I expected." "It took me 76 years and a floorboard to manage it properly," Marion said. "Give yourself more than a season." "Do you regret any of it?" Diane asked. "The hearing, I mean. Making it so public." "Sometimes I wonder if there was an easier way." Marion considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things Diane asked her, because her daughter rarely asked anything. She didn't genuinely want answered. "No," she said finally. "Not the hearing part. I regret maybe that it took your father dying for me to find out he'd spent our whole marriage protecting something I never knew I needed protecting. I wish he'd told me himself, some ordinary Tuesday, over coffee, instead of leaving it for a floorboard to tell me instead. But the hearing itself, saying it out loud in front of everyone, in the same building where my own father first put it into the record 63 years ago? No. I'd do that part again exactly the same way." "For what it's worth," Diane said, "I think Grandpa Dietz would be proud of how you handled it. Quiet, the whole way through, right up until the one moment it mattered, and then not quiet at all." Marion folded the foil over the last of the ham and set it aside. She reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand, the same way Helen Prather had squeezed hers weeks earlier in the church basement. A small, wordless current passed from one generation of careful, quiet women to the next. "That's the whole trick of it, sweetheart," Marion said, knowing exactly which moment is the one worth finally being loud for. On a warm afternoon the following spring, Marion stood on the newly sturdy porch. She watched her son and Ollie working the far end of the property. The sumac cut back at last. The barn's roof patched enough to keep the rain out through another winter. Something settled in her that she hadn't expected to feel again after Carl died. A kind of quiet, ordinary peace that asked nothing more of her than to keep standing where she was. Behind her, through the open kitchen window, the coffee can of silver dollars caught the late sun, exactly the way it had every clear afternoon since she'd set it there. 53 coins for 53 years, still counting nothing but themselves. You did keep your promise, she said quietly. To no one. To the empty yard. To a man 11 months gone who had spent the better part of a decade guarding a truth he trusted her, eventually, to find on her own. I just wish you'd told me sooner. But she understood, standing there, that Carl had told her the only way he ever knew how. Patient and quiet and certain. The same way he'd loved her for 53 years. Not with a speech. Not with a confession. With a promise kept so completely that when the day came, his family forgot her. The ground itself remembered, waiting under a loose floorboard for exactly the kind of woman who would eventually kneel down and find it.